Hey, Justin here again, here at Real English Party with another Real English Party pro tip. In our first Real English Party pro tip, I said that you should make an honest decision. Do you want to be an English student, or do you intend to be a real English speaker? If you have decided that you want to be a real English speaker, then the next Real English Party pro tip is your ego is not your friend. Your ego is not your friend. So what does that mean? First, we would need to discuss what is the ego. For the purpose of this pro tip, the ego is simply who you are so far. How you have known yourself and other people have known yourself to be until now. But when does the ego begin? The ego begins with what you do. When you're a newborn baby, you can't do much. You are just being carried places, being fed and being changed, and mostly you are sleeping. But as soon as you become mobile, that is, as soon as you can make a choice about where you will go, what you will pick up, what you will put in your mouth, your ego is being expressed through what you do. Shortly after that, you begin to speak. And then your ego becomes determined not just by what you do, but by what you say. As soon as you are learning to speak a language, you are learning to develop your ego based on what you say, which usually develops your ego much faster than you would based on just what you do. So why do we need to know this? We need to know this because if what you do is determined by your culture and what you say is determined by your language, then the ego is based on culture and language. The ego relies on its culture and its language for everything that it is. For this reason, the ego resists learning a new language. Just imagine a child who has just begun to develop a confidence in their identity by being able to understand and be understood in their native language. And then we tell them they need to learn a second language. It's almost like being a tadpole, fighting hard to grow legs and learn to jump and catch flies. And then after all of that, you're told that you must now be a bird. That is hard for children, and it only gets harder as they get older. And so the ego that is very much based on language and culture resists other languages and other cultures. This is a natural thing. The ego is not the enemy, but the ego is not your friend. Certainly not in the beginning. So, how does the ego grow? The ego is very much our physical self, but it doesn't grow the same way that the physical body grows. Our physical bodies seem to grow by themselves. Of course, the body just seems to grow as a function of time. Time passes and the body grows. The ego grows also, but it grows differently. It cannot possibly grow on its own. The ego grows by identifying with something outside of itself and then becoming that. For example, a child first identifies with its parents, his or her parents. Then the child begins to identify with siblings, brothers and sisters. Later, the child might identify with friends outside the home, might identify with teachers, might identify with role models, celebrities, idols in society. A child may then even identify with completely imaginary friends. And all of this is the process of the ego being exposed to something that it is not as something outside of itself and then becoming that. Basically, the child imitates the parents, then the child imitates its brothers and sisters, then the child imitates friends, teachers, celebrities, and this is how the ego grows, by seeing something that's outside of itself and becoming that by imitation. But as the ego grows, it becomes more and more dependent on what it is. As we get older, it gets harder and harder for the ego to accept being something else. And this is why the ego becomes resistant to learning new languages. It fights the process of learning a new language. So, how do we deal with this problem of an ego that doesn't want to grow? Well, one thing's for sure. Education is good, but the way that we educate now, where we just try to give people something that they can learn and remain the same while demonstrating that knowledge, is not really useful when it comes to learning a new language. Not if you want to speak it. We seem to think that we can give the ego all of the words and phrases to replace the words and phrases in its native language, and it will then begin to just express the same things that it wanted to express in its native language, perfectly the same way, but in a second language. That is impossible. The ego will never know as much of a second language to say everything that it could say in its native language. The only way the ego can grow in this situation, there needs to be something outside of itself that it can develop and then become. There needs to be an alter ego. An alter ego is sort of like the imaginary friend. It is another idea of yourself. Let's say you imagine an alter ego that is a real English speaker. It doesn't speak English as well as the ego speaks its native language, but it relies on English just as much as a child would rely on their native language, even if they didn't have much vocabulary or they didn't understand grammar. It just uses what it knows. Consider another self, a real English-speaking self that is something different from your ego, which speaks the native language. Now, when you do that, you will experience, again, that the ego is no friend to this alter ego. Not in the beginning. Because the ego wants to step in, and it wants to be, and it wants to express everything that it knows it can express. And so it will be very uncomfortable with letting an alter ego in that can't express any of the things that it would normally express. It can only express the things that it has recently learned in its English class. But when you're coming to the real English party, or when you're having real English conversations, you need to look at that as a situation not for the ego to express itself, but for the alter ego to practice and develop itself and get stronger. There will be a conflict, And the reason why it's so hard to speak English as a second language, it's because of that conflict. The conflict between the ego of the native speaking language and the alter ego of this newly acquired English. You will find oftentimes when you really want to speak English, only your native language is coming out of your mouth. When you really want to speak English, you can only think in your native language and then attempt to translate that perfectly into English. Impossible. That means that your ego is stealing the show. You want to take this as an opportunity for your alter ego to speak whatever it has learned, practice doing that, and to acquire more language through the process. You can tell when the ego is getting in the way. One major way that you can tell is that the ego will be very negative toward the process of speaking another language. In most cases, you will find yourself thinking about all the things that you can't say instead of whatever it is that you can say. Another thing is you will find yourself complaining about how difficult something is instead of trying to find a way to make it easier. You can see the ego thinking when it says in every situation, I don't know how to say this. How do I say that? Oh, I forgot how to say that. Oh, what was that word again? Oh, I'm so stupid. Or saying, oh my goodness, this topic is too difficult to talk about. The English-speaking alter ego would be saying instead, how can I use what English I know in this situation? If you use every English-speaking situation as an opportunity to do that, rather than to express the native-speaking ego, you will make more progress. And then as that alter ego, that English-speaking alter ego, gets better and better at expressing more and more, it then becomes something that the ego can become. So I think that you should engage in that process. Develop your real English-speaking alter ego and use every situation as an opportunity to practice what it can do. Let's say you have just taken your English lesson at your English conversation school or grammar school or what have you. They have just taught you how to compare things using English. Just after that, you come to the Real English Party, and your Real English Party host asks a very difficult question. He says something like, what do you think about Prime Minister Kishida's response to the pandemic? The ego responds this way. Okay, that's natural. Here is how your real English-speaking alter ego will respond. Oof. Maybe I don't know as much about that as you, but I think Prime Minister Kishida is more handsome than Prime Minister Suga. So I like Prime Minister Kishida more than Prime Minister Suga. Was that situation handled perfectly? No. And it didn't need to be, because that was not a situation for the ego to feel good about how perfectly it handled the situation. That was a situation, an opportunity for the alter ego to practice the English that it had just learned. That's my real English pro tip for today. Perhaps you may begin to see that the decision to be an English student is basically just remaining the same, being just the ego. But the decision to be a real English speaker means you do have to develop an alter ego, an English-speaking identity that is not controlled by the native language-speaking ego. So, of course, my pro tips will be helping you to do that, and we'll see you at the Real English Party as well, and you can begin to put these things into practice. Just remember the second Real English pro tip. Your ego is not your friend. That's all for now. See you next time.